English word. Okay. So the topic which we'll discuss today, obviously we're open to talk about any questions or ideas which people may want to talk about and have any questions maybe bothering you. Glad to discuss that. The topic I have prepared is about Abraham, the first Jew. And we have just been discussing the life of Abraham in the Torah. And being that he is the father of all the Jewish people, incidentally he's the father of many Muslim nations as well, it's probably worthwhile to discuss him and what his true qualities were and what distinguished him from other good people who lived at the time or who lived before him. What was so special about Abraham? And why does he become the father of the Jewish people? So we read all sorts of, especially this book of Torah, the book of Genesis, is a book which is filled with interesting stories. The question is, do we recognize the importance and the relevance of those stories? I once heard about a couple of people who were lost in a hot air balloon. The hot air balloon wandered off course and they had no idea where they were. So as they're drifting along, they go over the top of a building, and there's a man standing there on the top of the building. So they yell out, "Excuse me, sir, can you tell us where we are?" And the man yells back, "You're in a hot air balloon." And they slowly drift off. And one of the two people in the balloon turns to the other and says, "That must be a Hebrew school teacher." So he says, "Why a Hebrew school teacher?" He says, because what he said was true, but irrelevant. It's a Hebrew school teacher. That's the problem. So many times we read through stories in the Torah, and, perhaps we accept it as truth. It's true, but, it's irrelevant. How is it relevant, that which happened to Abraham, or the binding of Isaac, or whatever story, which may be fascinating, but how is it relevant? And that's a tremendous mistake, because what is a little trivia here, what is the root of the word Torah? What does the word Torah actually mean? And there's a root to the word. The root is hora'ah. And hora'ah means lesson. So the root of the word Torah is a lesson for life. So if I read the Torah and I come across it and I view it as a history book, I am missing the essence of Torah. That's absolutely not what Torah is about. Torah is hora'ah. Torah is a lesson. So if I read a story, I have to stop and ask myself, what is the lesson of Torah? That being said, there are many lessons to speak about with regards to Abraham. But interestingly, the first lesson I want to share does not have to do with what is written, but with what is not written. And I'll explain what I mean. We are introduced to Abraham. Actually, we are introduced to him before his name is Abraham. At the time we are introduced to him, his name is Avram, or Abram. How old is he when we meet him for the first time? 75 years old. God says to Abraham, "Leave your land, leave your birthplace, leave your father's home, to the land which I will show you." And then, it says, the very next verse, Abraham left. He took along his nephew and his wife. Ve'Avram ben chamesh shanim v'shivim shana b'tzeiso mecharan. I guess it's fine. I'm not going to read that much from the Chumash. We're going to get Chumashim, but we're talking about in the Parshas Lech Lecha, chapter 12, verse number 5. Avram was 75 years old when he left Haran, which raises the question: why don't we know anything about Avram's youth? Why are we introduced to him when he's 75 years old? If you are to look at the subsequent leaders, we hear about them from the moment they're born. We hear about Isaac from the moment he's born. Talk about his birth being a miracle and how he grows up. Jacob, we know about Jacob before he's born. We hear about Jacob and Esau, Yaakov and Esau battling in the womb of their mother Rebekah. Next week's Torah portion. We hear about him from before he's born. Moses, we hear about Moses the moment he's born. He's put into the basket. And he's set off into the water. So the subsequent leaders of the Jewish people We hear about them from their birth, or from their youth. We hear about King David from his youth. And Avraham, the first one, the first of the fathers, we don't know anything about him until he's 75 years old. So perhaps the answer may be that Avraham's youth, the first 75 years of his life, were really inconsequential. Perhaps there aren't many stories or lessons to be taken from the first 75 years of his life. And that's why it doesn't mention it. And that would be nice, except that's not the case. Because we do know the background of Abraham, not from the written Torah, but from the oral tradition. We know the history of Abraham, and it happens to be a fascinating history. More fascinating than the youth of Yitzchak and the youth of Yaakov. What is the story? So I'm going to share for the next several moments will be really the fascinating story of Abraham's birth. Who's the father of Abraham? Father of Abraham is an idolater? Idolater and an idol maker whose name is Terach. Terach. And yes, Terach says Terach comes in the Torah. Now here's a real riddle which most scholars don't know. What is the name of Abraham's mother? Because you don't find this in the Torah at all. Terach, it says. You don't find Abraham's mother. Her name is Amaslai. That's a very little known fact. Abraham's mother's name is Amaslai. Anyways, Terach is the defense minister of the most powerful king at the time, whose name is Nimrod. Nimrod was also a stargazer, who had a whole host of stargazers, astrologers, who predicted the future based on astrology. Which, by the way, is not something which the Torah rejects. In other words, Torah rejects astrology, but it does recognize the possibility of sensing messages from the stars. The point is, that's a complete side note, Nimrod is told by his astrologers that there is going to be a young boy born in your kingdom who is going to grow up and seek to destroy you. This is very eerily similar to a story later with Pharaoh, and the outcome is very similar too. Nimrod says, no problem. All boys have to be killed. All boys born have to be killed. And he has any woman who's pregnant brought to the palace, and there she gives birth. If she gives birth to a daughter, she's sent home with the girl. She gives birth to a boy. The boy is killed. Some 70,000 boys are killed because of this. His defense minister was a man named Terach, as we said. Terach's wife at that point, Amaslai, became pregnant with a child. Now, Terach was so devoted to King Nimrod that Nimrod allowed him and his wife to stay home, because Nimrod felt that if his wife gives birth to a boy, Terach will bring that boy willingly to the palace. Sometime later, Terach's wife gives birth to a boy, and they name the boy Abram. And obviously they're extremely afraid. Nimrod hears about the fact that Terach had a baby boy, so he sends a message. He says, "Please bring your son to the palace, as I trusted you would." So Nimrod initially responds, "How could I do this? This is my son." Nimrod responds, "If you send me your son, I will give you all sorts of wealth." To which Terach responded, that could be compared to someone telling a horse, "If you allow me to cut off your head, I will provide you with an abundance of hay." As you're saying, that's great, you give me all this wealth, but where is this wealth going if I have to give you my son or you're going to go? But ultimately, Terach knew he had no choice. But he devised a plan. One of his, unbeknownst to Nimrod, one of his maids, the maid servants in his home, also gave birth to a boy at that time. And instead of bringing his son, he brought his maid's son, claimed that was his son. That boy was killed. In the meantime, that's the story of the birth of Abram. Pretty fascinating. We're pointing, just his very birth is a fascinating story. Abram then grows up in the wilderness because he has to be hidden. And here's where you have the famous Medrash which talks about Abram coming on his own to recognize and become aware of the presence of God. Some say it was the age of 3, some say it was the age of 13, some say it was as old as 48. But either way, Avram on his own comes to recognize God. And this really differentiates Avram from the subsequent leaders or Jewish leaders. They were taught it by their parents. Avram's father worshipped idols. Avram's father had a store which produced idols. Today we have We have the American Idol, right? Isn't that a very common American idol? So I think we're going backwards. But so you have Avram who produced these idols. His father, so he grows up in the wilderness, and he has this very simple calculation where first he looks out into the world and he assumes, well, the greatest being I see is the sun. The sun must be the creator of all beings. And then he saw the sun goes away at night, so then he figures maybe it's the moon. Then he comes, by a process of elimination, he recognizes every being he comes across is limited and has its time. So he determines there must be an unknown, an unseeable creator of everything, and that is the creator that I will worship. And he becomes certain of it, so certain that he's determined to teach others about it as well. And eventually he goes back to his hometown, and over there his father and his brothers run this idol shop, and he's a troublemaker because when people would come in, he convinced them out of purchasing these idols. And the Medrash describes someone would come in, a woman would come in and ask for an idol for an idol which gives blessing of fertility, and he would show her an idol first, and then they'd start a conversation, and he'd ask her, so how old are you? And she'd say, well, I'm 35 years old, and he'd say, it's kind of silly that a woman who's 35 years old is going to be worshiping an idol which was formed last week. And using these basic areas of logic, he would convince people out of it. And then one day he did the ultimate evil, which was that he really got sick of this ridiculous way of life and these idols. So what he did is he smashed all of the idols in his father's store and put the axe, which he used, in the hands of the largest idol. Well, his father came back to the store and says to him, why did you do this? He says, me, I didn't do anything. He says, what happened was someone came with an offering of fruit as a sacrifice. And a terrible commotion, terrible battle was waged between all the idols fighting with one another, and ultimately the largest idol was victorious over the others. And his father looked at him and said, you think I'm a fool? These idols can't move. These idols can't talk. So the words he said in Hebrew are, Hashme la'aznecha ma shepicha medaber, which means, he says to his father, why don't your ears listen to what your mouth is saying? You just told me they can't move, they can't talk, then how in the world can you worship? Ultimately, at this point, he was captured by this King Nimrod, who realized now that ultimately this child wasn't killed. And here's where you have what is known as the very first test of Abraham. Abraham went through 10 tests, and maybe we'll get to that later, understanding what the significance of the 10 tests were. But Abraham goes through the first test, and the first test is that Nimrod says that Nimrod considered himself to be an idol, and he said either you worship me or you'll be thrown into the fire. The only way we know this is because we hear the Medrash says we know this from the name of the city he came from. We describe it as Ur-Kasdim, Ur, which means a fire. And really there was no city of Ur-Kasdim, but by describing Abraham as having come from the city of Ur-Kasdim, the Medrash says it's hinting to this first test. The first of Abraham's 10 tests was, would he worship Nimrod or would he allow himself to be thrown into the fire? And Abraham says, I will gladly be thrown into the fire because I believe 100% in God. Abraham was ready to give up his life for it. He was thrown into the fire and his life was spared. An interesting note is that Abraham's brother was standing nearby, whose name was Haran.
How come he wasn't killed?
So how come he wasn't?
How come he wasn't killed?
So Haran, until then, was wavering between Avram's way of life and everyone else's way of life. And when he saw that Avram being thrown into the fire, they turned to him and they say, what do you say? What do you go follow Avram's way or do you follow the rest of us? And he said, now I follow Avram. So he was thrown into the fire and he died. He was killed in the fire. Which is why we find this if you follow the Torah, we find this link between Abraham and Lot. Lot, his nephew. What's this link between Abraham and Lot? Because he, to a certain degree, felt responsible for Lot. Because Lot's father died in self-sacrifice after his miracle. Which I guess raises a question, why did he die? Why didn't he deserve to be saved like his brother Abraham? And the answer is because he only believed after a miracle. Notice his belief wasn't absolute. His belief was the same belief as a person who says, if I win the lottery, I'll believe. That's what he's saying. Now that I saw the miracle, I too believe. Well, that's not what God wants from us. God doesn't want us to believe only once we witness a miracle. The belief should be without that. And therefore, he didn't deserve to die, but he didn't deserve a miracle to happen. And naturally what happens is if someone is thrown into a fire, they won't survive. So his actions, his faith in God wasn't strong enough to warrant a miracle. But that too this is all part of the story of Abraham's youth. And it is after all of this, and therefore that story had a tremendous impact on those people around him, obviously. And that's where he gained his prominence and started becoming a leader. And that's why in the beginning of the Torah portion of Lech Lecha, when we are introduced to Abraham, it says he traveled together with all of the souls of the people he made. In other words, the souls of the people that he had influenced because of his youth and because of his sacrifice which he had shown and the miracles. So that's the reason behind all the people who travel with him when he is told to travel. And think about it. The people who are traveling with him. Abraham didn't know where he was going. God says, go. And Abraham went. So it's one thing, he went. But everyone else follows him, and they're asking, where are we going? I don't know. I don't know where we're going. I'm just going. And so the fact that people followed him showed a true following of people following someone, despite the fact that their leader has no idea where he's going. So, but the question this all leads to, this whole background, the story the Medrash tells us about the youth of Avraham, begs the question, why don't we hear about this? Why does the Torah choose not to say this in the written Torah? It's just mentioned in the Medrash. If this will be such an inspirational story, so then why doesn't the Torah let us hear all this? Instead, the Torah chooses to start after all of this and start when he's 75 years old with the message from God, Lech lecha me'artzecha, leave your land and go to the land which I will show you. Considering, again, that this story has a lot of inspiration to it, you would think it should be mentioned. And the answer, I believe, is a very important answer, which the Torah feels necessary to tell us when describing to us the first Jew. If you were to think about it, this first verse, Vayomer Hashem el Avram, God says to Avram, Lech lecha me'artzecha, leave your land and your birthplace and your father's home to the land which I will show you. This is the first message given to the first Jew. This is the first statement we have from God to the first Jew, being Abraham. And the Torah chooses this to be the first for a very important reason, and chooses not to mention his story for a very important reason. Because if the Torah would start with the previous part of Abraham's life, then one would think that the essence of Judaism is something which is accomplished. And that is, we learn from Abraham, if the Torah would teach us about the childhood of Abraham, the message we would take from that is that because Abraham accomplished so much, because he came to his own recognition of God, therefore he is a Jew. In other words, that the Judaism, or the fact that one can be connected to God, Jew or non-Jew really, that one could be connected to God is dependent on a person's accomplishments. That's the message which we would take from it. Avraham accomplished so much. He came to recognize God on his own. He came to put his life in danger for the sake of God. So because of his accomplishments, he earned a connection to God. He earned the right to be a Jew. He earned his connection to God. And that is the wrong message. In Judaism believes that the connection to God is not something which a person earns. It's a gift that's given. And therefore the Torah starts by saying, it chooses not to mention any of his accomplishments. It starts by saying, God said to Avram, I want you to follow my commands. And that is what made him unique. That is what made him a Jew. That's what gave him his unique mission, is because he was commanded to do something, and he followed what he was told to do. Not because of his accomplishments. Not because of his incredible talents, not because of his wisdom, not even because of his sacrifice, but simply because God told him, I have a special mission for you. I want you to do so and so. The first thing I want you to do is to leave your land. And he listened. And by doing that, he became connected to God. And therefore, when we read this, the message to us is, because again, if we were to read if the Torah would include first the whole story of Abraham, I would say, look, I'm not as accomplished as Abraham. I can't throw myself into a fire. I maybe haven't reached all these accomplishments, so maybe I can't relate to this. Therefore, the Torah says it's not about accomplishments. It's about being that Abram was told what to do and he followed. And that's something we can all relate to. That's something we are all told. We are all given different commandments. We are all told, God says, I have a book of commandments for you. And as soon as you keep them, you are as connected to me as Abraham was. And because of that, the Torah chooses not to mention his accomplishments. Because when describing the first Jew, describing the father of the Jewish people, it doesn't want to say that it's dependent on accomplishments, dependent on abilities or talents. It's simply dependent on someone following orders, which is what we find at the first command that Abraham was given. Abraham was given an order, leave your land, and he followed. And by following orders, he became connected to God. And that's the lesson. It's a very important lesson. Because as Jews, sometimes we do mistakenly focus on accomplishments. Many Jews take a lot of pride in the... and we hear, like recently, they gave out the different Nobel Prizes, and there's a strong, high percentage of Jews who have earned Nobel Prizes, and you hear that a lot. So we think, well, we're an accomplished people, but it's not really about accomplishments. It's not about how great a person is. It's about if a person accepts the yoke of heaven and is ready to follow the command of God, even if it's difficult, even if it means leaving your land. Which leads us to that very first commandment. What was the first commandment to God? Leave your land, leave your birthplace, and leave your home, and go to the place where I will show you. Isn't that unique that that's the very first commandment given to the very first Jew, as we said, is this kind of technical thing, leave your land. You know, you'd think it should be something else. You know, perhaps later in the Torah portion it says, the commandment to Abraham to circumcise himself. That would be, what you'd say, perhaps a significant commandment. But it's kind of technical. God wants him to leave. Okay, so he leaves. Why would that be the first? This is the first conversation he has with God. The very first conversation he has with God is, leave your land. And what's the significance? But the significance is very important. God is about to introduce Abraham not just to a commandment. God is about to introduce to Abraham an entire new movement. This is the beginning of the Jewish nation, right? This is the beginning. And from here we have, God says, the very next verse is, you will be blessed, you will have children. These words are the very beginning of a people which now stand some 3,500 years later. So this is the beginning of it all. And at the beginning, there's a very critical message. And that message is, if you are going to follow a new path, which I will show you, it requires you to be able to rise above your past. You have to be able to leave your past to embrace something new. And the three parts of his past are, if you will read, the verse says, leave your land, leave your birthplace, and leave your father's home. Your land, your birthplace, and your father's home. There are three elements that Abraham had to leave in order to embrace something new. And these three elements exist today to each and every one of us. If we are ready to embrace the path which God shows us, directs us through Torah, it requires us to be able to leave these three elements. What are the three elements? The first is your land, me'artzecha. The Kabbalah explains that the word Eretz is very closely, Eretz, which means land. Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel. The word Eretz is very closely related to the word Ratzon, which means desire. Ratzon means desire. Eretz means land. It's the same Reish and Tzadik at the root of those two words. So Eretz is connected to Ratzon. Land is connected to desire. The first message to Avram is you have to be able to leave your passions. Leave your desires. You can't have the best of both worlds. It doesn't mean that all desires are bad. It doesn't mean you have to live a life of deprivation. That's not what it means. But I can't be bound to everything I desire. We have lots of desires. Our animalistic side craves and wants and desires many things. If I'm going to follow this path, which God, I'm ready to commit myself to the path God says, I have to be able to leave those desires. I cannot be bound to those desires. That's number one. The next message is, The next word is mimoladetecha, from your birthplace. This represents your place, your city. You have to be able to leave the social. You can't be bound by social expectations. Your birthplace represents your city. We all live in environments, and the environments we live in many times has certain expectations of us. And perhaps we want to do the right thing, but I don't know how my surroundings, the people in my city will look at me, my neighbors. I don't know how they're going to think of me. How they're going to... a salesperson I once heard, a person who teaches salespeople once told me that he speaks to groups of people, and he generally asks them the following question: who over here drives an expensive vehicle? And generally speaking, he'll have 10 hands go up and drive an expensive vehicle. So he'll ask, why do you choose to spend an extra $30,000-$40,000 for a vehicle, when for a lot less you can get a perfectly comfortable vehicle which drives from point A to point B and has air conditioning? He says, and when they're honest, he says the answer, which is the ultimate truthful answer, is to impress the neighbors. That's why I spent the extra money on the car, more so than any other reason. So there is this idea that the neighbors have an impact on a person's city. So the second step is told Avram, if you want to move on a new path, you have to be able to leave that. Again, this doesn't mean to reject your surroundings, doesn't mean to become obnoxious. It just means you should not be bound by the expectations of those people around you. Many times the expectations are good and high expectations, so you should try to live up to them. But sometimes the expectations keep us back. And those expectations from society should not bind. You have to lech lecha. You have to leave not only your own desires, but also you have to leave the influence of those surrounding you if you are ready to embrace a new path. And finally, and this may be the most difficult, is the Bais Avicha, from your father's home. And this too, in certain circumstances, this could be a very sensitive matter. But nevertheless, it's a matter which is important to point out. And that is that a person has to be able to break out of the shackles even of family in order to embrace the path of Judaism, the path which God dictates for them. Now, the reason I say this is sensitive is because at the same time, Torah obligates us to love and care for family. But in the event that a family of a person is holding them back from being a better person, from being a more committed person, then God says that too, a person shouldn't be bound by that either. And therefore, God says to Abraham, the first commandment to Abraham is not, you can look at it just kind of in passing, leave your land, or you can look at it from a much deeper level. That he said, leave your birthplace, leave your land, leave your birthplace, leave your home. God was saying, if you are, and you are, ready to embrace a new path, a path which will now be the birth of a nation, then it begins with the ability to break out of that which holds you back in the past. A person can't say, well, I want the best of both worlds. I want to be able to be bound to my desires, to cave into every passion, desire I have, and at the same time, I also want to embrace the path of God. A person can't. A person has to be able to break out of the shackles of the past to be able to embrace a new path. So that's the significance to the first message given to Avram. Lech lecha me'artzecha. I know I've spoken a whole lot. There hasn't been really any questions, comments, thoughts, disagreements, arguments, protests. Yes?
Is there, I recall long ago having something called the Book of Yashar?
Sefer HaYashar.
That talks about Abraham's childhood?
It could be the Medrash. Well, some people consider the whole book of Genesis to be called Sefer HaYashar. It's another name for Genesis. But yes, it could be that there's a Sefer HaYashar which describes the childhood.
Shem raising Abraham?
So it does say that. There's a lot of medrashim on this. Medrash, which is the more the tradition we have passed down of the story. Again, none of it is mentioned in Torah, but it does mention that Abraham went. Some people say studied under Shem and perhaps even met Noah.
Yeah.
Because Abraham was born, I believe, during the lifetime of Noah. Interestingly, Abraham was born in the year from creation of 1948, which is unique in 1948. That's the year that Abraham was born. Yeah. Yes?
And Abraham's brilliance, how did he know for sure like God was talking to him? I mean, how did he come to that?
You know, I don't know. That's a good point. Until God speaks to me, I can't really answer that question. Because I guess somehow those who God spoke to knew. I guess there are people, unfortunately, today who think God speaks to them, and maybe it's not the case. But somehow, I guess when it happens,
They don't say anything about it.
right? No, it doesn't say anywhere about how one would know, but it seems that when it happens, one knows. So I don't know. That's a good question. I don't know. Yes.
Where did the word Jew come from?
No, that's a good question. It came much later.
England.
Well, maybe the term Jew came later, but the Jew, I mean, that's really a topic in itself. And that topic, if just kind of randomly, really connects to a specific holiday in the calendar. That's the holiday of Purim. Because it is in the Megillah that we come across the term Jew first. You don't come across it in the 5 books of Moses. What is the term Jew? Jew is a shortened word for the word Judea. Judea comes from the word Yehuda. Yehuda. So in Hebrew, the term is Yehudi. Right? You've heard the word Yehudi, which means Jew. Where's the first time we come across the word Yehudi in all of Torah? In the book of Esther. Ki Mordechai ha-Yehudi. Mordechai the Yehudi. And that begs its own question. Why is Mordechai called Yehudi? Mordechai, Yehuda, Judah was one of the 12 tribes. And Mordechai didn't even come from him. Mordechai came from the tribe of Benjamin.
That's right. That's
So-
what I wanted to say.
So Mordechai came from Benjamin. So he should be a Benjaminite, not a Yehudi. So that we'll have to file away and discuss during the Purim, because that's a lengthy discussion itself. But the term Jew.
Called Hebrews then.
So I don't know where the term Hebrews. Ivri.
Yeah.
I guess Ivri, which we do find Avram was called Ivri. Avram Ivri, the root of Hebrew is from the word Ivri. The root of the word Ivri,
Oh,
Aver.
the cider.
No, it's actually not. It's not from Avram. Ivri is with an ayin, which means Aver. He crossed over because Abraham crossed over the Jordan. So Avar is crossing over, and Ivri is the one who crossed over. And so therefore he crossed over, and his descendants crossed over from west to east. A couple weeks ago, I happen to be somewhat of a sports fan. So a couple weeks ago, the Detroit Tigers,
Oh, don't say that. Oh.
they played a very critical game against the Oakland Athletics. And it was the 5th game, the final game of the series. And they had to go to Oakland, and there was all sorts of suspense. Would they win? Would they lose? And they played on a Thursday night, I believe. That Thursday, I gave a lunch and learn. And that week's Torah portion happened to be the Torah portion of Lech Lecha. So I told people at lunch and learn, I said this. I said, you have nothing to worry about. It is clear as day that the team is going to win tonight. I said, it's very simple. Why is that? If you look, the very first words of the Torah portion are, Lech Lecha, leave, and God was telling Abraham to travel west, because he was east of Israel. He said, travel west, and the very next verse is, you travel west, you'll be blessed, and all sorts of good things will happen to you. I said, there's no question. I said, I don't even know why they're playing the game. It's already a foregone conclusion. And we even, so one of the people there was very excited. He said, he said, I don't trust you. I said, if I am right, will you come to shul on Shabbat? He said, yes. And he never came. He didn't end up coming. He didn't end up coming.
The next time.
He didn't end up coming, and that's why the team lost in the next round, because he didn't follow up on his
But
obligation.
they went east, so
But they went east. Maybe that was the problem. Anyway, so this is the...
Rabbi,
Yes,
do you have a Bereshit with you?
I do.
26:5.
26:5.
עקב אשר שמע אברהם בקולי,
Yep.
לשמור משמרתי, מצוותיי, חוקותיי ותורותיי.
Yeah.
How come תורותיי?
You know what? Actually, what I'm going to do is I'm going to... Because I believe Rashi addresses that question. And I see here it doesn't have Rashi.
Torah in plural.
Oh, right. Oh,
Torotai.
you reminded me. Right, Torotai. By saying Torotai, he was saying, because we have a tradition that Abraham observed the Torah, despite the fact that it was not yet given, as a sort of form of prophecy. He knew the obligations God would demand of the Jewish people, and he observed them. And within the Torah, there are 2 Torahs. There's the written Torah and the oral tradition. It's called the Torah Shebiktav and the Torah Sheba'al Peh. So Abraham was careful, not only the written Torah, but even that which would be the oral Torah afterwards. I have, thank you. So the Torotai is a reference to both Torahs, that he observed the written and the oral Torah tradition.
The word Torotai appear also in Moses' time. When Jethro came to him and told him, I have to teach the people Torah.
He says Torot?
Yes, Torah. When Jethro came to him.
Sure.
That's so that's not the only time he appeared.
Right. All right. Should we, I see it's already 10:02. Any other questions, or should we try to get another idea in?
Was Abraham's brother born under Nimrod?
Correct.
Otherwise he would have been killed.
Well, right. He was born, I guess, before either before or after that vision of the stargazers had. So therefore, there was no decree, edict at that point. What's interesting about, we mentioned, and we have a moment, although if there's any questions, we're happy to take them. But what's interesting about Avram is that Avram is known for the tests. And in fact, we talk about the 10 tests of Abraham. The Pirkei Avos, the Ethics of Our Father, it says that Abraham was tested 10 times to indicate how precious he was in the eyes of God. And this is a very deep idea. It's very difficult to perhaps truly appreciate. But this idea that he was tested just to know how precious he was in the eyes of God. What does that mean? That means that God tests those who God trusts can pass those tests and wants to lift them up, and therefore they are tested. So Abraham was tested. He went through the difficulties because God wanted him to pass those tests. This can be compared to a king who tells the teacher of his child, who not only teaches his child, but teaches all the children in the palace. He tells the teacher of his child, I want you to give my child the hardest assignment. I want you to put my child on the hardest horse to master. Because I love my child, and I know that he can grow, and he can accomplish that. So therefore a test is an indication of God's trust, and therefore God's preciousness in this person's eyes. This is obviously very difficult. We all go through tests. This is something we can all relate to. And it's definitely difficult to stop in the middle of a test and say, in the middle of a test in life, perhaps it's a test within health or wealth or within our children, whatever it may be that challenges us at the time, and say that God is testing me, and God only tests. In the Talmud, there's a saying, Lefum Gamla Shichna. That's not even Hebrew, it's Aramaic. Lefum Gamla Shichna, which means, according to the camel is the load. Which means a proper camel owner knows exactly the weight that this camel could hold. And just as he will be careful not to put any additional weight on the animal, he'll also be careful not to put anything less than the camel could hold, because then one is not receiving the full potential of that camel. So therefore, we'll make sure, obviously you don't want to overload the animal, but you don't want to underload the animal either. So the Talmud uses an analogy to point out that God gives each of us the load that we can handle. If we were to give us any less, then we're not fulfilling our potential in life. Again, this doesn't necessarily make it easy, but this is the idea behind the tests of Abraham. God tested him, gave him a load because he knew that he could handle it. And this explains something interesting. The Hebrew word for test is nes, nisa, Elokim nisa es Avraham. God tests Avraham. Nun samach. Now the word nun samach nes has another meaning, which is miracle. On the dreidel, the letters stand for Nes Gadol Hayasham, a great miracle. Nes is a miracle. What's the connection between a miracle and a test? What's the link? They seem to be completely unrelated, yet they have the same exact letters make up those words. The answer is because they both serve the same function. And the function is to be found by analyzing a third word, a third meaning to the same word. there is another word, there is another meaning to the word nace, and that is a banner. A banner is called a nace. You lift a banner is called a nace. So now you have three meanings to the same two letters. Test, miracle, and banner. What's the common denominator between test, miracle, and banner? The answer is that both a test and a miracle become banners. And what I mean by that is as follows. When one is tested, one is then lifted up. One then becomes a banner, lifted up like a banner for all to see the accomplishment of this person. If a person is tested and passes the test, we now know the inner strength that that person has. Otherwise, we would never know it. If a person faces a test and comes, that person is lifted up like a banner. And now we see the strength of this person. When Abraham was tested and passed those tests, Abraham was lifted on a banner and he was shown, you see this person, the follower of the one God, look how wonderful this person is. Look how strong this person is. And ultimately, that's what a miracle is about too. When a miracle happens, that's God raising a banner, identifying himself to the world. Look, a miraculous event happened that's reminding us that God is there and God continues to direct the world. So both a miracle, the nace, which is the miracle, and nace, which is a test, become the nace, which is the banner, which makes something apparent, which otherwise we may not have known. Yes?
Any connection with the month of Nisan?
Yeah, so the month of Nisan, which is slightly different. It happens to be that the Hebrew months are not Hebrew words. They're Babylonian words. But even so, we say Nisan is definitely connected, even though it's an Aramaic word. But it's a month of miracles. The month of Passover is a month of miracles. So yes, it is connected, even though again the actual word Nisan is Babylonian. What's that?
I really love the way you said the nest, the three meanings of the word nest.
The three meanings of the words, and they're all connected. And again, perhaps that provides some strength when a person is facing every one of us faces our individual tests, and when we do, we should look at it as a certain sense of that God is trust that I can handle this, and trust that by handling it, by passing it, I will now reveal the inner strength which I may never would have known otherwise that I had. So allowing me to pass this test reveals to me and to those around me the abilities and the strengths that I have. Anyways, with that, I think we'll conclude. It's been a pleasure as always. Hopefully we'll come back again in a month from now. I know some of you, everyone's welcome to, but some of you we're starting a medical ethics course next week. In the Detroit metro area, the Jewish Federation, all are welcome. But otherwise, we'll be back here in a month from now. Perhaps we'll talk about Hanukkah then, because maybe that'll be the upcoming holiday.
We're going. If anybody wants to go,
Where are you going?
to the class.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
I think I mentioned it to you about